Faith and Politics, a show dedicated to discussing issues surrounding the intersection of church, state, and politics, and the examination of whether you're allowing your faith to shape your politics or are your politics starting to shape your faith. In other words, what do you do when God and government come face to face? I'm your host, Orlin Johnson. Let me introduce you to our guest panelists for today. First, we have the Congressman from the 4th District of Maryland, Glenn Ivey. We have the Reverend Dr. Galen Carey, who is the Vice President and Director of Government Affairs for the National Association of Evangelicals. We have Dr. Timothy Golden, who's a professor of philosophy at Whitman College. And we have Mr. Tim Schultz, who's the president of the First Amendment Partnership. Gentlemen, it's great having you here with us and looking forward to talking about our topics today. You know, the Biden administration has released the country's first national strategy for combating anti-Semitism. It's a landmark plan that's really addressing a number of growing problems. This strategy has over 100 different steps. It has 100 different specific calls to action. It's requiring us really to take a look at the civil society, local governments, academic institutions. It's unbelievable to think that we have to actually put something in place like this in terms of protecting an individual or organizations from a religious standpoint. But the Anti-Defamation League has basically been tracking almost 3,600 incidents of harassment, vandalism, and assault. And the reality is, which is unbelievable, is that the Jewish population only represents about 2.4% of the U.S. population. However, the victims of these type of activities is nearly 63% that's been reported. And somehow the FBI is supposed to be responsible for really kind of policing this, and then in some ways trying to police hate. You know, Congressman Ivey, I've got to ask you a little bit about this. First, I want to congratulate you on hearing that the new FBI organization is going to be moving its headquarters to Maryland, but they're also going to be living in a place that probably has more religious organizations per square mile than maybe any place else in the United States. But when we start to take a look at what's going on from the idea of anti-Semitism and protection that's necessary, I noted that there was nothing there for other religious groups, but the focus was really on Jewish Americans. What have you been hearing in Congress, and what is this all about in our society?
Yeah, it's interesting. We just had a hearing on this in the House Judiciary Committee last week. That also focused primarily on the Jewish community. And as you pointed out, that's a large and growing problem. I think we need to do even more to try and address it. And I'm glad the White House put the strategy forward to start moving it in the right direction. I mean, we've got scenarios where University of Maryland's in my district. We have synagogues in our region here. People are afraid to go to worship. You know, they're starting to go back to virtual worship.
Wow.
So that they don't have to expose themselves, quote unquote, going out into the public to go to places of worship. We've got students who are afraid to go to classes on campus or afraid to live on campus. So it's a significant problem. It is an issue too that is, you know, hate is not limited to the Jewish community. And I think the United States sadly has a long history of challenges there. We all can think back to when churches were being burned down in Black communities. There's anti-Islam issues that are going on in the country as well. So I think it's important for us to try and figure out how we can all work together to address this. Religious tolerance is important across the board. We need to make sure that we have communities working together and working in coordination. But it also, as you mentioned, you know, enforcement's critical here too. We need, whether it's the FBI at the federal level, state and local prosecutors. Many states have anti-hate crime laws on their books as well. And then in places like college campuses where there can be a social enforcement and other layers of enforcement to make sure that students are working together, living together in a proper way and in tolerance and support of each other.
You know, Galen, from your perspective, representing a large group of evangelicals, how do you end up viewing this type of legislation?
Well, first, we want to acknowledge that anti-Semitism is a scourge on the human race that's been with us for a very long time. It goes back centuries, probably millennia. And so it's something that is very, very difficult to eradicate. But nonetheless, a very important issue, and we commend the Biden administration for addressing this issue. It's something that probably is even more in the public mind now because of what's going on in the Middle East. And it's an issue in which ordinary people can be blamed for the actions of others, other countries, other governments. And there's so many fears and anxieties that politicians or other people who mean not to do well can build on to try to gin up more hate. And so it's really good that the Biden administration calls attention to this. As you mentioned, they have a very large number of steps. So it's in some ways a laundry list of all the possible things that might be done. And most of them, you have to say, most of them are not really things that government can do on their own. This is a matter of the human heart. So I think the church has a huge role to play here in helping to cultivate people who are not going to be people of hate, because Jesus certainly taught us to love our neighbor, even to love our enemies. So and so certainly people that God has blessed through the call to Abraham should not be people that anybody should be hating. And so there's a lot of things that we can do as churches and as other civic organizations and even as individuals. But there is a role for government too, and we're thankful that they're going to try to take some steps that we pray will help to lessen this scourge.
If I could just pick up on Galen's point there, it's important for us, I think, to remember the words of the late Justice Thurgood Marshall. If I could paraphrase him, he once said during an anti-lynching campaign when he was general counsel for the NAACP that the law can't make a man love me, but it can stop him from lynching me. And I think that's what we have to keep in mind here, that these are matters of law enforcement, but they're also matters of the heart. And I think Galen's point is well taken, that we will go much further from a faith standpoint if we have an internal sort of conversion, right? If we begin to stop anti-Semitic hatred from within, and if we begin to live as religious people of all faiths from the inside out rather than from the outside in, then we can go much further than we can with measures in law enforcement. Now, law enforcement is absolutely essential where people are victims or targets of anti-Semitic violence. I think the law has to be carried out and people have to be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. But I think it is important for us to remember, as Galen pointed out, the law has its limitations. And if you're not anti-Semitic and if you genuinely care for human beings, chances are you're not going to be on the wrong end of an indictment for a religious hate crime, right? But if we ignore our hearts and ignore living from the inside out, then we're kind of spinning our wheels, because while we can prosecute people and even lock them under the jail, what we can't do by the law is change people's hearts. So it's important to separate the moral from the legal here. And as people of faith, from a spiritual standpoint, understand that most of the work has to be done internally by us and not externally by government. But we need both for sure.
You know, Tim Schultz, have we seen this type of activity happening before? I mean, we talk about the Biden administration, but I'm assuming that these type of conversations have been happening prior to this current administration. And, you know, and even when you start thinking back to, you know, the concept that Herzl had regarding, you know, the need for a Jewish nation, because there was an idea that they could be safe no place else in the world, so find a place to come home. It just seems like all of this is really something that on one hand you increase awareness, but sometimes increasing awareness also increases bringing out the crazies. How do you try to find the right balance to make sure that we're actually helping this group?
Well, so I think the crazies are going to come out of the woodwork no matter what, because that's what crazies do. And I think that actually for people that are non-crazy, we have to kind of admit what the state of affairs is in America right now. We have an anti-Semitism problem on the right, and we have one on the left. And there are people that will say they're not being anti-Semitic, but they really are. If you see some of these rallies that are happening right now, there's rabid anti-Semitism being proclaimed, from the microphone. And you see the same thing. I think that those are mostly on the left. Those are mostly on college campuses. But then you're seeing on the right with despicable figures like Nick Fuentes meeting with former President Trump, and that whole brand of anti-Semitism. So I just think that people that are not crazy, who believe, as Galen rightly said, that anti-Semitism is a scourge on the human race, we have to call out and marginalize that kind of anti-Semitism when it comes from people that are sort of ideologically, theoretically our allies. I just think there can be no place in our politics on the left or the right for anti-Semitism. And it ought to be absolutely squeezed completely to the margins and the fringes and not allowed to gain any ground. Because remember, Charles Lindbergh was at one point one of the most famous and admired people in America. He was an open anti-Semite. In the 1930s, we had 15,000 people at a Nazi rally in Madison Square Garden. And one of the reasons the United States treated Hitler with kid gloves for so long is because anti-Semitism was actually a pretty common thing in America. And we can't have it be that way again. And we need to acknowledge what is in human nature that allows this kind of thing to go to seed. And we have to say, we should just acknowledge that it could happen again, right? And we have to say never again.
Congressman, as you have discussions there in your houses of legislation, this seems to be something that seems to be stopping, coming. But the idea of the protection of houses of worship and the reminder that we are a nation that allows all religious groups to really worship freely seems to be something we have to constantly keep reminding the public.
Well, yeah. Unfortunately, as I think we've all said so far, I mean, this is a challenge that's been with not just the United States, but with humanity for thousands of years. Anti-Semitism dates all the way back. It's almost as far as you can go. And the challenge is still with us. We have to keep working hard and remain vigilant, and make sure that we do everything we can to push as to the extent we can, this type of hatred to the fringes. I think there are times where prosecution is going to make sense. I think there are times when, the law won't be able to actually do that, but especially on college campuses right now, I think what's being passed off as expression of, First Amendment rights. I think we have to have the pushback on that and make sure that even if they aren't breaking a criminal law, making sure that they know that, this is unacceptable. You've crossed lines, and this is a community, whether it's a college campus or a neighborhood or a place of work, where that's not acceptable, and we're not going to tolerate it here.
What we really need to do, besides opposing hate, we need to reach out to our Jewish friends and neighbors because they're feeling under attack. And so we need to show them some love and care especially at this time.
Well, I think that's exactly what we have to end up doing. We have to basically have more communication, demonstrate that civility should be still the way that we all live, and and there's nothing wrong with always having a little bit of love in our conversation with our fellow man. Gentlemen, I'd like to talk about this case, which is called Catholic Charities Bureau versus the Wisconsin Labor and Industry Review Commission. It's kind of an interesting concept in the state of Wisconsin where unemployment insurance programs provide financial assistance to those who have lost their job through no fault of their own. But under that state law, there's certain nonprofit organizations in Wisconsin can actually opt out of the program, including those that are operated primarily for religious purposes. The Catholic Charities Bureau had requested an exemption, but for some reason the state did not think it was appropriate. They have their own kind of programs that they work with that they thought made more sense financially, but because of this specific law in Wisconsin, it seems as though that was not coming together. Galen, when you take a look at what goes on with these type of cases that are being, brought forward on a regular basis, it seems as though they try to put a regulation in place that looks like it should cut across all segments of society. But whenever it bumps up against something from a religious standpoint, everything seems to go out of whack. When you think about this particular case, what are your thoughts and how do we address this in our society nowadays?
Yes. So on the one hand, it seems that this is a case that may not be that important because Catholic Charities is not saying that they have a religious objection to providing unemployment benefits to their workers. They just have a different system for doing that in which they provide the same level of benefits. But what's really at stake here is whether the government is the one that gets to define what a religion is and what makes something religious. And we have a long tradition stemming all the way back to our Constitution and the First Amendment to say that Congress cannot make any laws about religion, and they can't prevent people from practicing their religion. And out of the First Amendment, we have what's called the church autonomy doctrine, which allows churches to handle their internal affairs on their own, and government should not take sides in internal religious questions. Okay, so what we see here, so the National Association of Evangelicals joined a amicus brief in this case because we think it's very important that the concept of what makes something religious is for religious people to decide. The state was making rather strange arguments that, well, because Catholic Charities does things like help feeding the poor and helping the homeless, they said, well, those aren't religious things. Everybody does that. And because they were not proselytizing while they were doing these things, and they're helping people who were not even Catholic. But of course, that's part of Catholic doctrine is of most religious faiths that you don't only help your own people and that you don't only do cultic things, but you also do things that help people in their daily lives. So it's a pretty important principle at stake here, and it's gone all the way now to the Wisconsin Supreme Court. I think it's unfortunate that, especially in Wisconsin, but even elsewhere, the whole judiciary system has gotten embroiled in politics in a way that's unhelpful, where you talk about electing judges who belong to one party or another party. In fact, judges ought to be pretty far removed from partisan politics. Nonetheless, we're hopeful that this case can be decided in consistent with a long line of Supreme Court cases that emphasize the point that religious groups do have this freedom to organize themselves and to decide what is religious for them.
Tim Schultz, when you think about these type of topics, what do we do? How do we come in? I mean, we got religious groups now that seem to be clearly religious groups, but now you have other groups sometimes that want to call themselves religious groups so they can fall into some of these requirements or protections. You know, how are we handling all of this right now?
Well, I think the starting point is to recognize that we're going to have more of these conflicts over time. And the reason is because over time, society grows more complex. Government has to grow more complex, and it inexorably, I think, grows larger to address some of these problems. It's not even a criticism. It's just a fact. And when that happens, and we also have a civil society alongside government that is largely religious in the United States, we're going to have the civil society that is religious in the United States bumping up against government in situations like this. It's inevitable that situations like this are going to grow. And I would say the principle that I would want to sort of lay down is we need both. We need both to be vigorous. We need both to be good at what they do. Our society would break down if we didn't have either one of those operating at close to max capacity. But at the same time, we need government to respect the fact that there's this longstanding tradition that religious groups can't do what they do if you sort of define everything they do as secular and then say that they have to play by secular rules. Because the secret sauce of religious organizations like Catholic Charities is you have a lot of people committed to their faith, willing to do it for lower wages, to work for less money than they can make in the private sector, that are motivated by their faith to go out and do things that frankly aren't that sexy, right? And so when government makes rules that tells those groups that, basically they're secular, or they have to work and they have to make rules internally as if they're a secular organization, they're really sort of telling Catholic Charities, we're going to take away your secret sauce. We're going to take away what makes you Catholic Charities. And I think that's the principle that we ought to worry about, because that's often the way certain folks in government think. And I think that's an unfortunate mistake.
You know, Congressman Ivey, that concept of having to figure out how do you allow religious organizations to operate under their own sphere of what they believe, but in the same breath, making sure that because they do get a lot of power and a lot of exemptions and really the power to discriminate, that we make sure they're not doing it in a way where they're using their religious cover or their religious protection as a sword as opposed to being a shield. And I have to imagine that's one of those balancing arguments that you find yourself in Congress dealing with regularly.
Yeah, I mean, it's a challenge in a way, as Tim sort of explained a moment ago. But during my career, especially when I was state's attorney in Prince George's County, which is the local prosecutor, but even now that I'm in Congress, we've always been reaching out to the faith community and trying to encourage them to do as much as they can to help out in the community, because we talked about this a little in the last segment, but government can't do everything. And even if you could, we don't have the resources to do everything. It's great to team up and leverage to the extent you can with the faith community, because you can expand your reach and you can reach people who wouldn't necessarily want to interact with the government in any event. So I think we want to make sure we don't do things to create barriers to that sort of coordinated work. The point that Galen made a minute ago about the proselytizing issue, it's a little ironic, because when we give out government grants, frequently, faith institutions are required not to proselytize. But at the same time, in this case, apparently, Catholic Charities got essentially kind of penalized for not proselytizing, and that's one of the reasons they weren't given the religious status under the First Amendment that they sought. So it's going to be tricky. The courts are going to have to work this out over time. But I think while they're sorting this out, we've got to make sure that we've got a lot of needs out there that need to be addressed, and government and the faith community are doing everything we can together to get those addressed.
One of the things I'm thinking about, Orland, is this. I'm trying to figure out what is the state's interest in not allowing Catholic Charities to administer their own program, which they believe does the same things as the state's program. So I don't know. I don't know exactly what the state's interest would be. As the congressman just said, it's not as though this is an establishment problem. It's not like they are proselytizing when doing the program, their own program. So I'm trying to figure out what exactly is the state's interest here. And it'll be important to keep an eye on this and see how it ends up. But I think an underlying thread in this conversation is really that the courts are the last bastion of democracy, right? When we have these disagreements, when we can't figure out issues of religious freedom, we go to the courts. And because our society is structured the way it is, and frankly, because the Constitution is structured the way it is, there is an inherent antagonism between the religion clauses of the First Amendment. How do you promote the free exercise of religion without establishing one? And so that's a challenge that I think is really perpetual, and that one of the great joys, I think, of being an American is that we will hopefully have a judiciary that is capable of adjudicating these issues, because we're always going to come back to the courts. It's sort of just the way things are set up. I will say this. I think it's interesting that we expect judges to be apolitical after they run in statewide judicial elections. I think there's a case to be made for merit selection of judges at the state level that's a pretty strong case to be made. So I don't want to open up another can of worms, but I thought that was a point that needed to be made.
Galen, when you think about this whole idea of we got a question regarding religion, we're not sure where it should go, but somehow we have to get in front of a judge that we have no idea what their personal beliefs may be. And although they're supposed to be giving you a balanced approach, I think sometimes it's a little bit difficult to take the politics out of politics, depending on where you are. So now I've got somebody who may have no idea of any religious beliefs who has to make this determination. I mean, is that a struggle that we're going to continue to have, or is it just hoping for the best results?
Well, I think it is a challenge, not only for the judiciary, for the legislative branch as well. I mean, you recall in a recent confirmation hearing for Justice Barrett, one of the senators said, your dogma lives loudly within you, and apparently that's a bad thing to have a dogma. In fairness, it is a challenging issue to get it right, and we're not wanting a theocracy where religious people run the whole country. We're wanting a democracy in which there's equal participation for all citizens, and that requires, and with respect for religion, because the state's interest is to have a thriving nonprofit and religious sector who are contributing to the common good.
Well, I think I have to make that the final word, but I think you're right on point there, that we've got to figure out how to peacefully coexist the secular aspect and the religious aspect, and understanding that sometimes we overlap, but we want to ensure that we are still getting what's in the best of all Americans. Hey, Tim Schultz, tell me something I don't know.
With the news that the new FBI headquarters is going to be located in Maryland, which is great for me as a Marylander, it's worth remembering what a historical scoundrel J. Edgar Hoover was and is, not just his bugging and permanent campaign against Martin Luther King and company, but just all kinds of things that we should remember him as perhaps the worst public servant of the 20th century, and really consign his memory to the ash heap of history.
Tim Golden, tell me something I don't know.
At least one, possibly two, of President Trump's criminal cases against him will be postponed, allowing him to continue to be the first president in American history to run a political campaign off of his own indictments.
Galen, tell me something I don't know.
With polarization at an all-time high, there is a bipartisan bicameral bill in Congress called the SSI Savings Penalty Elimination Act that for the first time would remove the marriage penalty, and it would allow disabled and low-income elderly Americans to save more of their own money to fulfill their dreams.
Wow. Congressman Ivey, tell me something I don't know.
Senator Ted Cruz, Republican in Texas, is going to get knocked off next year. Congressman Colin Allred, who's an African-American Democrat running in Texas. Yes, I said African-American Democrat running in Texas. I think he's going to beat him.
Wow. Well, gentlemen, I want to thank you for being a part of our show today, and I especially appreciate those final comments. Thanks again for being here with us. Hope you enjoyed our conversation. And just remember, if it's about God and government, it's faith in politics. See you next time.